Cybersecurity is something that is a focus for all of us, and understanding where to focus your resources to align with what is actually happening in the environment, what the threats are, what are the realistic risks for you. And this session is really about how do we can create that culture of security for all of you by using offensive testing or penetration testing, and jump into it. All right, a little bit about me. I've spent most of my career as being a defender of enterprises, both large and small. So I come with a background of how do we defend environments and how do we use things like penetration testing to complement or enhance or augment the teams that we're managing, or how do we use it in a capacity when we don't have our own internal team to defend us and we'd rely on partners. Today's agenda, again, we're going to cover what it is, what types of penetration tests are there to watch out for, how do we properly scope a testing engagement, what should we expect as far as reporting coming out of a penetration testing engagement, and what are those quick wins that we can all either do or ask of those providing IT services to us, whether it's our internal IT or people that are providing it to us as a service. Just some quick things that we can look for help with and make sure that we're covering these that really make an adversary, which is what we're trying to emulate here, make their lives much more difficult. So what is penetration testing? What are we talking about here? We're talking about offensive testing services. So that is emulating or simulating what a malicious actor would do in an environment to be able to assess where we're at and identify either gaps in our security controls or weaknesses in our systems or our networks, and allow us to understand what we should focus in on next in order to properly protect our environments. Well, some of the big benefits of doing this penetration testing is to proactively harden our environments, to again reveal those security weaknesses and rate them by severity so that we can have some roadmap as far as trying to figure out what things we should focus on first. It also does things like help us deliver secure software for less money, because it's a lot easier to fix things on the front end rather than having to retrofit or completely retool systems or websites or those types of things after the fact. It can help us avoid breaches or minimize the effect of breaches by discovering vulnerabilities and your gaps proactively. You can remediate them, you can fix them, and those are less options than a malicious actor has to take advantage of. It also helps you avoid the cost of downtime and cleanup associated from a breach. Gives you an easier time getting cybersecurity insurance renewals if you can convey to your insurance provider that you are taking security seriously and you're taking proactive steps to make sure that you're hardening your attack surface at your organization. Again, you can help protect your good reputation and protect relationships with business partners. They view you as a less risky partner to be associated with. Penetration testing really focuses on that human insight from an attacker's perspective. Malicious actors, they chain together things like low risk events or low risk vulnerabilities to continue to leverage them to get more access and abuse the systems that you have in place. The malicious actors, they adapt to the environment they're in. So our testing, penetration testing, is designed to adapt to your environment as well. Understanding the implications of vulnerabilities and scanner results, that requires human insight. It can't just be the output from a tool, because it needs to be put in the context of why it matters for you, and really understanding vulnerabilities and how they enable that unauthorized control within your environment. Some of us have to deal with compliance initiatives. So third-party testing in order to meet compliance, whether it's from healthcare or the financial services industry or PCI or other types of regulatory bodies that require us to actually do proactive testing as part of our information security program. It helps us eliminate false positives and allows us to focus in on those things that actually matter for us. There's some things that just appear to be huge information security risks, where maybe that risk doesn't really matter to your environment because of other controls that you have in place. But understanding those types of things so we can validate that which controls are working, which controls aren't working, and where we have opportunity for improvement, and how do we establish a roadmap that allows you to continue to get your organization more secure. It also allows you to, along with that roadmap, roadmap out the remediation. So not saying there's going to be gaps, but in nearly every testing engagement that we go through, there are gaps that we identify, and it allows us to just plan appropriately and make sure that you are focusing on the right things first. And it allows us to just demonstrate business impact, because knowing how all these things that seemingly are very, very technical and very attacker and defense focused, what does it actually mean to your business? What does it mean if your primary systems go down? What does it mean if you get ransomware and you can't access any of your systems in your environment? Can you even communicate to any of your employees to tell them that they shouldn't come in to work? Does that mean that you can't take any new orders? Does that mean you can't fulfill existing orders? And this is just generic across any industry. We all depend on technology so much in everything that we do. And then it also allows us to decide if we need to augment the IT security team, whether that is named individuals in our organization, or if we depend on other people to do our IT services for us, and gives us a fresh set of eyes from a third party that can allow us to maybe understand those vulnerabilities and weaknesses in our environment, and again, help prioritize and realize that maybe we don't have as much resources that we need in our IT security team right now, or maybe we are perfectly staffed and we're able to understand that we're in a good spot. This is not doing testing for the sake of proving how good the tester is and how awful the organization is. It's about identifying gaps and weaknesses and what controls are working or not working, and how we use this to prioritize improvements to the environment. And again, it's about how do we create a plan together that's going to help move you forward in a measurable way. And how do we give leadership confidence that you can actually protect what you're supposed to be protecting? There's a ton of value in partnering with the right companies from a penetration testing perspective, and learning what works. And creating that good working relationship can be hard, but it's extremely rewarding in knowing that you're able to protect things appropriately. Let's start off with vulnerability assessment. So penetration testing and cybersecurity is a journey. It's not a destination. And so we're going to talk through where this starts for most people in their testing cycle, and understanding where their weaknesses are, and using that to grow up the IT security program. Typically, we'll start with vulnerability assessments. And vulnerability assessments, we really want to understand is your patch management processes. Are they working properly? Are you managing vulnerability risk effectively? So specifically, those vulnerabilities that are known to have exploitable code for them. So are they known to be exploitable vulnerabilities, and are you managing them appropriately? And then are there dangerous items associated with known attacks that are what we would consider so dangerous because they're being used live every day, day in and day out, and they've been documented as dangerous, that we should just drop everything and focus on them first before we can even move forward and start asking questions about how we're doing our patch management and how we're doing our vulnerability risk management processes. So some big things to think about here are, from a technical perspective, credentialed or not credentialed. So traditionally, providers have done non-credential scans. And what I mean by that is, are we starting from a point of having rights using an account that already exists in your environment, or are we starting from nothing? And so I believe that we should always be starting from a point where we have credentials. And the reason for this is that's where an attacker is starting as well. They're compromising an endpoint, and they're starting from that point as a user in order to see what's in your environment. So we should be starting from that point as well. Also, when we start referencing those things that are dangerous and associated with known attacks, even above and beyond things that have exploit code available to them, there's this thing called the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. And so this is a knowledge base. It's globally accessible. It's out there for all of us to use. It's a knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques based on actual real world observations. And this knowledge base is used for the foundation of how do we protect things in both the private sector, the public sector, and government, and just all over. How do we use this known data from known attacks in order to improve our defenses? And because there's only so many ways for a malicious actor to do things in an environment. They either need to bring their own code, their own malicious code. They need to take advantage of what is there. So something called live off the land, binaries and scripts, just those things that come included with all of our operating systems. So for example, Microsoft Windows has many things that are located in the C drive Windows folder. And those things are just come with Windows. And of those, there are known things that can be abused for various stages of the attack chain. So moving laterally from one system to another, downloading files and staging them for other systems, getting around rules that you may have implemented in your network because you trust things that have been provided to you by Microsoft. So those live off the lands, binaries, and scripts are super important to keep in mind. But the third option is to exploit vulnerabilities or configuration issues in software that's already on our systems and networks. And that's where our focus is on vulnerability assessments, is how do we reduce risk from things that are vulnerable in our environment. The next step up from getting beyond vulnerability assessment is a network penetration test. And so here we're going to do manual and automated penetration testing processes. We might use some commercial tools, we might use some open source tools or proprietary stuff that we've built to assess where your infrastructure is from the perspective of an adversary. Again, this is going to be slightly more collaborative in that we're here to help You understand the risks associated with the vulnerabilities, and where we were able to exploit things and validate things are not false positives. And our processes are designed to focus in on best practices, including some of the NIST guidance, PCI DSS, the OWASP Top 10, and again referencing the MITRE attack matrix. And one of the things here is we're starting with a remote testing appliance that we've provided, or the testing partners provided to the organization. This gets plugged into the network and allowed to be part of the network. And then from there, we assess what's working and what's not working from our perspective. What controls do you have in place that are very good? Where are the gaps as we continue to work through that attack chain, of really looking at, can you get malicious code on an endpoint? Can you establish command and control? Can you get persistence in an environment? Can you survive a reboot? Can you elevate privileges? Can you move laterally? Can you do the data exfil? Can you move through all these different stages of the attack chain? And this type of test is designed to be noisy. We're not trying to be stealthy like ninjas and not be found. We want to make sure that your detection mechanisms are seeing what we're generating. We want to make sure that your tools have an opportunity to block us. We want to be basically running around with bells on, essentially, in your network, making sure that you can see what we're doing and validating that you have proper visibility to all the things that are important. The next step up the ladder from a testing perspective is what I would call assumed compromise testing. And so there's a lot of different things that other providers may call this. It might be called an assumed breach test. It might be called a purple team. It might be called some flavor of a red teaming exercise. But again, where we're trying to focus in on here is starting from a point of a compromised asset, because that's the most common scenario most of us are going to face unless we have internet-facing assets. We'll get to that in a bit here. Assumed compromise testing, we're going to work through that attack chain that I just referenced. And to get a little deeper on that, we're starting as if a user has clicked on something or has downloaded something off the internet and run it, some sort of malicious code has allowed an endpoint to be compromised in your environment. And from there, as an adversary, we're going to work through that attack chain. So command and control. Do we have the ability to remote control this computer, this asset, from over the internet somewhere as an attacker would? Would we be able to configure and survive a reboot, getting that persistence mechanism? Because if we're just in memory, or if we're just got the malicious code on the endpoint and set up that command and control, doesn't mean that it's all going to go away when it restarts. So we want to make sure that we're able to survive a reboot. We also hopefully haven't compromised something that has local admin rights. So we're going to be focused in on how do we get more rights on that system in order to continue to map things and exploit things. We also need to get access to other systems on the networks. We need to be able to move laterally. So we're going to test the ability to work through other systems and continue that circle of compromise and persistence and command and control and privilege escalation and lateral movement over and over and over again throughout the network. And then we get to the objectives of things. And so here we want to test the ability to exfiltrate some test data from the environment and making sure that we have the ability to, from a defender's perspective, detect this kind of stuff. And so we get into some choices around this and how mature of an environment that we're in and doing this testing in. And so Do we want to be stealthy or do we want to be noisy? So if we're just starting down this line of testing with someone, we want to start noisy. We want to test to make sure that we're seeing what we should be from a defender's perspective. How collaborative do we want to be? When we first start working with clients, it's less collaborative. The defending teams oftentimes don't know what to look for, what the key things are in their environment to be watching for as we're working through this attack chain. And then as we go through more of these cycles, we start becoming more and more collaborative to the point where either virtually or physically in the same room, being able to have very quick back and forth between the offense, the testers, and the defense at your organization to work quickly and test through your control structure. So is your endpoint protection working the right way? Are your firewalls configured the right way? And those other types of things that you may be implemented through group policy or other control structures in your environment. And then we start working through that attack chain and understanding where your weaknesses are from a detection perspective. And did you see this? And we stopped this. Was this you? That sort of back and forth banter that goes through the testing cycle. And our goal here is really how do we become an effective sparring partner for your organization so that once the real event occurs, because it will, is your organization, is your team prepared, and are they trained up on the right way to handle things? This eventually, if we go through more and more of these sprints, becomes a live action incident response where your team really can start to understand, okay, what was the timeline of events? Where were the key pieces that we need to strengthen our controls? Where were we good? And being able to tell that story of the pen test from the defender's perspective gives leadership an incredible amount of confidence, knowing that we have people that can do the right thing, that can understand what an attack is, that we have tooling and visibility to our endpoints that allows us to know where we're at in an attack and how to respond, even though during these tests, it's really in an observational perspective, but it gives us the confidence to know, because of those sparring matches, that when the real thing occurs, we're ready for action. Some of the other things to keep in mind is, do your defenders know what normal looks like? Can they identify not IT people trying to do IT things? Because a malicious actor or malicious code is all trying to abuse those IT things that a lot of IT people do to support everything that we do during the course of the day. They're just using it a little bit different. So should not IT people be doing IT types of things in your environment and knowing what normal looks like? That's huge. We talked a little bit about the live off the land binaries and scripts, those things that are already in your environment, whether you want them there or not, that are provided as part of using Microsoft Windows or using Linux or using certain softwares like Microsoft Office or M365, those things that can be abused for various parts throughout that attack chain, the command and control, the persistence, the privilege escalation, the lateral movement, the data exfil, all those things that we can abuse in an environment without even having to bring malicious code as an adversary, as an offensive testing team. Can we find or prevent those types of things? Because most of our security tools inherently trust things that are signed by Microsoft or by other software vendors. And so can we understand, because these are very real things. These are what adversaries are actually using in our environments as they work through that attack chain of ransomware or data theft or breaching our systems. You can't just jump to stealing everything. You can't just jump to encrypting everything. You have to work your way through that attack chain. You have to get on the box and you have to do these other actions. So from a defense perspective, we want to make sure that we're measuring how soon Did they know that something malicious was occurring? What kind of visibility did they have to the endpoints? And throughout the testing cycle, did they have those traps or those tripwires or those honey accounts, those things that give them a head start in knowing that something was up? Things like canary tokens and all of these other probably very technical things that that I'm talking about here. Did the first malicious action trigger a response, whether it's automated or it was a human-driven response? And what does that visibility look like? Do you have the ability to automate certain responses in your environment, or is it going to depend 100% on people? And the control structure, so all these things that we think that are implied to all of our endpoints to protect us, things like weak protocols, getting rid of SSL version 3, or protocols like LLMNR, and again, very technical things, but when we remove them from our environment, do we know that we've actually removed them from everything, or do we just think that they're removed? Do the controls that we think are in place, are they actually working? And again, when we get into those more iterations of this assumed compromise testing, can the defenders tell the story of what happened by interpreting what their tools are telling them? That's extremely important. Can they do timeline analysis? Can they understand from a process execution or network connections or files or data being touched, or hosts being accessed, or weird stuff being modified, or just those behaviors that they've observed? Because there's a lot that goes into becoming an incident responder and understanding what actually happened. And then we start getting into specialized tests, things like web application testing. So we're focusing in on our externally facing websites, our API integration with business partners, whether we have APIs or whether we're accessing APIs from our business partners. We're testing mobile applications to make sure, again, that we're properly securing and protecting sensitive data in these things, and not that they're not becoming a access point into our internal environments, whether they're in the cloud or on site at our networks, making sure that they're not that ingress point for an attacker to continue moving and getting into our environment. So when we start talking about scoping, we want to understand what size of environment is it? Is it in the cloud? Is it on premise? And what are your goals for testing? Because we should not be just doing a test because we want to do a test. We should be expecting results out of it, and certain goals, like where are our weaknesses, where can we focus our improvements for the next year. We also need to set expectations around resources and time, because we do not have unlimited budgets for both people time and for duration of testing. People can only focus on a test for so long from a defender perspective. And so we want to understand, we want to think in the terms of sprints and how long those sprints can be. Typical sprints are measured in weeks. So we're focused in on a week's worth of testing here, and then we're using those results to prioritize things for remediation and creating that roadmap of how we get more secure. Whether that's a week or 2 weeks or a month, I mean, we're thinking in terms of weeks as when we're starting to think about goals. We can go smaller, we can go bigger. But again, we're trying to set some expectation around how involved from a defender we're going to be, and how collaborative we need to be from a offensive testing team, from the penetration testing side of things. And are we going to be focused in on being stealthy? Are we going to be noisy? Are we going to be very visible so that we can make sure that those opportunities for catching us, that we're getting those what should be gimmies? And then we start getting into things that can potentially hurt all of us. So Typically, when we talk about this, we're thinking about old systems, and we're going to ask questions about what are the top 5 systems that you generally have stability issues with. Have any other testing broken things? What were the results from the last penetration test, and were there any negative results from that? We want to make sure that we're all on the same page, both from an offense and from a defense, and setting those expectations, and making sure that we're honoring the defense's ability to keep the lights on, because going through an offensive test from a defense perspective doesn't stop you from needing to do things to keep the lights on in your organization. You still need to be responding to people reporting phishing emails, and are they really phishing emails or not? Responding to endpoint security alerts, responding to all of these things that go on that you're actually hired to do in the course of your day, along with making sure that we're making progress on all the projects that we have assigned to the defense over the course of the year as well. And then we also want to set the expectation that if we run into a control that's working really, really well, EDR is a good example. So EDR is the next generation of antivirus that we have on hopefully every endpoint in every organization that we're testing against. We want to set the expectation and make sure that we're having the conversation around how long are we going to struggle against a very effective control before we have a conversation around, okay, we need to drop this control so we can continue to test in the organization. We don't want the focus of this test to be limited artificially by one control working effectively. Once we've spent an appropriate amount of time testing against that, we want to note it. We want to call out good behavior. We want to call out controls that are working very, very well and make sure that that's included in the report. But we also need to continue moving through the other layers of your environment to make sure that we're getting a broad test and a good perspective across everything that we can test in your environment, given the limited duration that we have. We want to get a holistic view of gaps and weaknesses so that we can get a good roadmap for how to partner with you for improvement. Attackers, malicious adversaries, don't have the same constraints we do from a testing perspective. They aren't limited by a week. They aren't limiting by 20 hours. They aren't limited by months. If they want to spend the time, they can. They're also not limited on resources. They're not worried about overwhelming the defenders. So they don't have the same constraints that we do. And we want to make sure that we're able to work effectively through the attack chain across the environment and making sure that we're providing value during the course of all tests. And then having a plan for what the process is for something if it goes wrong. Making sure that we can very quickly have that line of communication open. If a system goes down from a defender perspective in the organization, that we're able to have a very quick communication channel to the testing resources to confirm that either, yes, it could have been affected by the testing, or no, it was not part of the scope of testing, so that we can move forward with troubleshooting and making sure that if something is affected, that we can all work on responding appropriately. I'm going to move on to reporting here. It's expectations that I would have from a reporting perspective. So we want to focus in when we're delivering a report from a penetration testing side of things on calling out those things that are good in an environment. What is working? It's extremely important to validate that the things that we thought were in place are actually working. It's also good to reinforce good behavior. We want to collaborate with the organization on how we create that culture of security in the environment, and making sure that we're recognizing and calling out for leadership where good things have happened. We're also focused in on things that matter for the business. Things like, where is your sensitive data, and did we get access to it? And given the role that we started the test in, so if we started from an assumed compromise testing, should we have had access to that sensitive data? And if we should not have, what needs to be done to remediate that? And does that situation exist for more than just the one role that we started from? And we want to focus in around strategic recommendations. So how do we make recommendations that matter to you as a defender, and making sure that we're providing a level of effort and where you should prioritize your work in remediating, in fixing and solving the gaps that are identified. How do we better protect our key systems? We also want to understand where we would have expected to get caught from a malicious action perspective when we're going through this testing. We also want to provide some perspective of how did you do against your peer group? How did you do against the last certain number of testing engagements that we went through? And do we need to focus in on controls and solving gaps technically in your environment, or is this policy related items? Is this, we need to get better trained staff? Again, is it a program versus process, or a people failure that is leading to these gaps? Do we need to make changes to protect versus detect? Do we need to focus more on just preventing rather than relying on our alerts to tell us that something is going on? Did our tools that were supposed to be in place, or the controls that were supposed to be in place, did they work the way that we would have expected them to? And is there additional opportunities for detection? Things like canary tokens or honey accounts, or those detection thingies that when somebody uses or somebody touches, no legitimate user in your environment would ever do that. So it gives us an instant indication of the alarm bells are ringing, an intruder is in the house. And we also want to make sure we're calling out the successes. And when we put these types of reports in front of senior leadership or executive leadership or corporate boards, they can only solve these gaps a few ways. They can invest in more people. They can invest in training up their people. They can buy stuff, or they can contract additional help. And so how can we position you for getting those improvements in your environment and helping you prioritize and solve problems the right way? Some more thoughts here I'm going to jump to. So with this type of testing, we want to focus in on those improvements and identifying the gaps. And how do we enable you to convey confidence into senior leadership, into executive leadership, or into the owners of the company, or into a corporate board, just depending on the type of organization? What are the base controls that actually worked in your environment, and what should we be putting in as far as those base controls that can solve many areas within the MITRE attack matrix or that attack chain? How do we, as a testing firm, make our customers, make our clients into better adversaries, into better defenders of their environment? How do we focus on reducing the attack surface? How do we automate things that we can? How do we simplify processes? thinking of things this way allows us to continue to scale up our defenses. We don't want to just focus in on how do we continue to hire more people as we grow the business. How do we effectively scale the information security team, regardless of whether it's an internal team or it's someone that we're paying to do it on our behalf, like a managed security provider? How do we scale that so that it becomes more cost efficient as we grow? From an offensive side, how do we give confidence to the defenders on what is working? As we reduce our attack surface, as we take away options for an adversary, we force them to start making decisions. And so every decision that we can force an adversary to make is a chance to catch them. The more chance that they have for making a wrong decision is an advantage to the defender. And just thinking about the attack chain and knowing that you can't just jump to encrypting everything, that you can't just jump to stealing everything, you can't just jump to manipulating a payroll system or manipulating a system of record, you can't just jump to wiring or ACHing money out of a company. You have to go through those certain steps in order to get to that point. So again, the can you get malicious code on an endpoint? Can you survive a reboot? Can you remote control that asset from over the internet? Can you find more privileges and get more rights on the environment to continue moving through it as a malicious actor? And can you move laterally across multiple systems in the environment to get to what you're after? All of those various steps give us as defenders a huge advantage. So when we start thinking about ransomware is something that we can effectively manage and reduce the risk. I wouldn't say that anything is ever 100%, but we can be very, very confident that we are well defended when we start focusing on these various actions that need to occur as an adversary in our environment and focusing what we're testing on and how we're putting those protections, whether they're preventative measures that just block things or they're detective measures that allow us to have alerts to check things out and to investigate things. So raising the cost of an attack by stopping those common exploits, how do we make it harder for a malicious actor? How do we force the malicious actor to be so noisy in our environment that they basically catch themselves? And that should be really one of our goals as a defender. And then, because cybersecurity insurance is a huge thing, how do we use these results to communicate our testing program to our cybersecurity insurance carrier to make sure that they understand the level of care we're doing in our environment from a testing perspective, and potentially use those results in our testing program to start talking about how do we reduce our premiums, because everybody's premiums have gone up over the last couple of years, and this can be an effective way to making sure that the premiums that we're paying are as low as they can be. All right, I'm going to jump to some quick wins that we can all do in our environment. There we go. All right, so what are those few things that we can all do in our environment that would just make it harder for an adversary to do things? So a couple of quick things. Multi-factor for everything that is external to our environment. Ideally, we would want to use multi-factor internal as well, but anything that is exposed to the internet, all of those apps, all of those systems that we're using, whether it's a payroll system or it's a line of business or it's salesforce.com, whatever it is, we want to make sure that anything that's exposed to the internet just has MFA enforced, multi-factor authentication. And so this is very often implemented by you using your username and your password to log in, and then it sends a text message to your phone, or it uses an authenticator app on your phone to approve that login. So it's tying something you know with something that you have in order to make sure that if your credentials are compromised, an adversary can't get in and be you within those systems and manipulate them with the rights that you may have. Passphrases. The world needs to move beyond 8-character passwords. We need to start talking in terms of 20-character plus passwords. And that sounds horrible. But when we start thinking in terms of passphrases or sentences, those are things that we can implement fairly easy, especially if we're focused more on length than we are on complexity. So if we get rid of special characters, but we're enforcing length, we're actually further ahead. So things like, this is my passphrase. And again, please don't use that, or a combination of animal names and animal sounds, or really whatever you can think of, just using combinations of words, whether you want to include punctuation, an actual sentence, an inspirational affirmation to start the day when you log in, whatever works for you, but we want to be beyond 20-character passwords. And then from the IT folks in that maybe are watching this, we want to ramp it up for service accounts, because we know that certain things in environments are they're targeted for abuse. And we know that offline attacks can be used against these things, like capturing certain communications going back and forth between systems, and then taking those captures offline in order to try and brute force them through high-end computers with GPUs that can do very rapid password tries against these types of systems. So we really want to get over 100 characters for service accounts. Again, it sounds horrible, but these are things that can configured once and very oftentimes forgotten for years at a time, or rotated once a year. So these are not things that people are going to be using to log into systems. These are things that are running in the background. Once we start getting beyond those three things, we want to, or these two things, we want to start looking at how do we eliminate weak protocols that just basically give up at the first time of being poked. So things like SMB version 1, RC4 ciphers, SSL 2 and 3, SMB signing, LDAP signing, extremely dangerous LLMNR, or removing old versions of PowerShell, or unquoted service paths, or making sure LDAP or LSAS protections are enabled, and getting rid of NetBIOS over TCP/IP, and a lot of these types of things that you may not have understood what I just said, but reach out to us at Eide Bailly, because we'll give you the list. This is not secret sauce. This is just, if you did these things, which are very easy to do, we can eliminate a ton of risk from our environments. And by that measure, reduce the gimmies that attackers are using every day to move throughout the attack chain. So before we get into questions, we strive at Eide Bailly to be a full-service cybersecurity partner. While the focus of today is on penetration testing, that's only a portion of an information or a cybersecurity program. We also offer virtual CISO, so virtual Chief Information Security Officer services, to be the expert that you can engage to assess your current capabilities and provide a roadmap on how to get where you want to be. That strategic advisor that allows you to be confident that when you're making decisions for your business, that they're not going to expose you to more risk. And we also offer managed security services. So do that ongoing monitoring of everything in your environment if you don't have staff, or to augment your current staff. Things like doing vulnerability management and making sure that we're monitoring that appropriately, and making a plan for how to reduce those in your environment. How to continuously monitor log data so that you have a head start when we start to identify malicious actions in your environment. How do we provide insight based on all that stuff that we're monitoring, in order to make strategic recommendations on how to reduce risk over the next month, the quarter, the year, that sort of thing. And we can help with defense. Above and beyond the managed security services, we can help with remediating findings, getting rid of vulnerabilities in your environment. We can help with implementing solutions, and we can help with making sure that your existing solutions are properly configured, whether they be cloud-based or internal to your network. So there's a lot of advantages to working with a partner that is holistic in its approach to managing cybersecurity. So with that, Amy, I guess I would ask you if there's any questions that we should be addressing.
Sure. Let's see here. We do have, excuse me, one question that says, can you speak to the cost of doing a vulnerability assessment?
So yes, so we would want to have a scoping discussion, again, to understand expectations and then also the size of the environment. So this is going to be based on the number of things that you have in the environment along with your expectations. So we would just welcome the opportunity to get on a scoping call, and then we could provide a proposal in front of you.